When I tell you this story, I want you to understand, I wasn't looking for trouble. It found me. A few months ago, life was ordinary. Work, home, repeat, the usual grind. I wasn't someone who believed in ghost stories or urban legends. But that changed when I found myself driving along a desolate highway late at night. The road stretched on for miles, cutting through a forest so dense that my car's headlights barely seemed to penetrate it. It was the kind of drive where the silence isn't peaceful. It's heavy, almost alive. I was heading to a small town upstate for a freelance gig, but I was running hours behind schedule. Blame it on bad weather, or maybe just bad luck. Rain had started to pour, first in drizzles and then in sheets, forcing me to slow down. My GPS, already unreliable in these rural areas, went out completely. I was left following a two-lane road with nothing but darkness on either side. That's when I saw the sign. It flickered in the distance like a mirage, barely visible through the rain. A glowing red neon sign that read, Riverview Motel, vacancies. The letters buzzed faintly, some of them flickering like they couldn't decide if they wanted to stay lit. Beneath the sign was a hand-painted wooden board. No vacancy. No problem. Come on in. At first I hesitated. The whole setup felt off. The way the sign seemed to appear out of nowhere. The eerie emptiness of the place. But then again, it was late, and I was exhausted. My options were limited. Just one night, I muttered to myself. Get some sleep, and you'll be back on the road by sunrise. The driveway leading to the motel was gravel, crunching under my tires as I pulled in. The building itself was a single-story strip of rooms, each with a faded green door and a small porch light. Most of the lights were off, but a few glowed faintly, casting long shadows in the rain. I parked near the office, a tiny square building with large glass windows. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could see a man behind the counter. He was tall and thin, with a pale face that seemed too sharp in the dim light. He didn't smile when I entered, just nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting me. Room for the night? He asked. His voice was low, gravelly, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Yeah, just one night, I replied, shaking off the rain as I stepped closer to the counter. He slid a key across the desk, its brass tag stamped with the number 7. Cash only, he added, almost as an afterthought. I handed him the money, noting how cold his hands felt when they brushed mine. Is it usually this quiet around here? I asked, trying to make small talk. Always quiet, he said, his lips curling into what I think was meant to be a smile. But there was no warmth in it, just something unsettling. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a rundown roadside motel. Beige walls, a stiff-looking bed, and a boxy old TV that probably hadn't worked in years. The carpet smelled faintly of mildew, and the single lamp on the nightstand gave off a weak yellow glow. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't here for luxury, I just needed rest. Yet as I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rain continued to drum against the window, masking any other sounds. A faint knock, not at the door but at the wall. The thin, hollow knock of something, or someone, tapping on the other side of the room. Probably just a neighbor, I told myself, even though I hadn't seen another car in the parking lot. I tried to ignore it, but the knocking came again, and again. Steady, deliberate, like a message being sent in some code I couldn't understand. I got up, my pulse quickening, and pressed my ear to the wall. The knocking stopped immediately, but just as I began to relax, I heard something else. Faint, muffled voices, like a conversation happening just beyond the wall. Except, the room next to mine was supposed to be empty. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the whispers. They were too quiet to make out, but their tone wasn't friendly. It was low and urgent, like an argument. And then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. I backed away from the wall, my heart pounding, and returned to bed. You're just tired, I told myself. You're imagining things. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but notice something strange. The faint sound of dripping water, not from the rain but from inside the room. I turned my head slowly toward the bathroom door. It was slightly ajar, the light inside flickering faintly. I hadn't turned it on. That's when I saw it, a shadow, faint but unmistakable, moving behind the door. The door groaned as I pushed it open. The bathroom was small and unremarkable. A chipped sink, a stained mirror, and a bathtub with a faded shower curtain. Everything looked just as it had when I'd first entered the room, except for the faucet. It was dripping, despite being tightly shut when I arrived. The sound echoed in the tiny space, each drop hitting the porcelain sink like a ticking clock. I reached out to turn the knob, but as my hand touched the cold metal, I caught sight of something in the mirror. At first, I thought it was my reflection, but the longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't mimicking my movements. It stood there, motionless, its features blurred like a smudged photograph. And then it tilted its head, just slightly, like it was looking at me. I stumbled back, my phone slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The light from the screen cast long, distorted shadows across the walls. When I looked up again, the figure in the mirror was gone. I didn't wait to find out more. I slammed the bathroom door shut and leaned against it, my chest heaving. My mind raced with excuses. A trick of the light, a smear on the mirror, my own paranoia. But deep down, I knew it was none of those things. Something was wrong with this place. I grabbed my phone, ready to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I considered heading back to the office to confront the man at the counter, but as I peered out the window, I noticed something strange. The neon sign that had drawn me here in the first place was off. The parking lot, too, was darker than before. The porch lights of the other rooms barely flickering. But what really caught my attention was the car. When I'd arrived, mine was the only vehicle in the lot. Now there was another, a black sedan parked a few spaces down, its windows dark and reflective. I hadn't heard it pull in. I stood there for a moment, watching, half expecting someone to step out. But no one did. The car just sat there, silent and still, like it had been there all along. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. "Get a grip," I muttered, trying to steady my breathing. But before I could think of my next move, I heard it again, the knocking. This time it wasn't coming from the wall, it was at the door. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks, each one louder than the last. I didn't move, I couldn't. I just stood there staring at the door, willing whoever, or whatever, was on the other side to go away. "Hello," a voice called. It was low, almost too soft to hear. "You dropped this." I blinked, confused. "Drop what?" The voice came again, clearer this time. "Open the door. I think this belongs to you." Every instinct told me not to. I stayed frozen in place, barely breathing. And then, as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. I crept closer to the door, peering through the peephole. At first I didn't see anything, just the dimly lit parking lot and the rain falling in sheets. But as I strained my eyes, a shape emerged from the shadows. A figure stood just beyond the reach of the porch light, its face obscured by the dark. In its hand, it held something small and shiny. My phone. But my phone was still in my hand. My blood ran cold. The figure stepped closer, and for the first time, I saw its face. Or rather, the lack of one. Where there should have been eyes, a nose, a mouth, there was nothing but smooth, featureless skin. I stumbled back, my hand fumbling for the lock. But before I could turn it, the knob began to rattle violently, as if the figure was trying to force its way in. "Let me in," it said, its voice no longer soft but guttural and demanding. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran to the bathroom, slammed the door, and locked myself inside. My heart pounded as the sound of the rattling grew louder, more frantic, and then just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. I didn't dare move. I stayed there, huddled on the bathroom floor, until the first light of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the door. When I finally emerged, the room was empty. No sign of the figure, no sign of the black sedan. Even the neon sign outside was glowing again, as if nothing had happened. But when I went to the counter to check out, the man behind the desk gave me a strange look. "Room 7?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion. "Yeah," I replied. He hesitated, his pale face unreadable. "We don't rent that room out anymore." I stood frozen at the counter, staring at the man's expression. What do you mean you don't rent that room out anymore? I asked, my voice trembling. The man's gaze flicked toward the parking lot and then back at me. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Room 7's been closed off for years. I don't know who checked you in, but you shouldn't have stayed there. I felt a chill creep down my spine. I don't understand. You were the one who gave me the key. He blinked, visibly confused. I've been here all night. I didn't check anyone in. My stomach dropped. I turned to glance at the parking lot through the office window. The rain had stopped and the black sedan was gone. For a brief moment, I thought about arguing with him, but what could I even say? Instead, I slid the key to room 7 across the counter and muttered, I'm leaving. As I turned to walk away, his voice stopped me. Wait, he said, his tone uneasy. What happened in there? I hesitated, the events of the night rushing back to me. The shadow, the figure at the door, the knocking. I shook my head. I don't know, but something's wrong with that room. The man nodded grimly, almost as if he'd expected my answer. You're not the first to say that. I froze. What do you mean? He sighed, his eyes darting to the parking lot again. A couple of years ago, a family stayed in room 7. They were just passing through like most folks. Husband, wife, 2 kids. Seemed normal enough. But in the morning, when the cleaning staff went to check, the room was empty. Empty? I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. Empty, he confirmed. Their car was still in the lot, their luggage in the room, even their breakfast order left on the nightstand. But the family? Gone. No sign of them. The police looked into it. Was the motel. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering in my chest. That couldn't be right. I'd been driving straight for miles. There was no way I'd circle back. But there it was, the same rundown building, the same empty parking lot, and when I looked closer, my car was parked in the exact same spot where I'd left it. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the scene in disbelief. No, I whispered to myself. No, no, no. I turned the car around, determined to drive in the opposite direction. But after another 20 minutes, the same thing happened. The neon sign appeared again, blinking at me like a cruel joke. I stopped the car and got out, standing on the side of the road, my legs trembling. The air felt heavy and the silence was oppressive. That's when I heard it, a faint distant sound, like laughter, children's laughter. I turned toward the woods lining the road, squinting into the trees. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and then I saw them. 2 small figures standing just beyond the tree line. A boy and a girl, their clothes damp and torn, their faces pale. They stared at me, unblinking. Are you lost? The boy asked, his voice eerily calm. I took a step back, my instinct screaming at me to get back in the car. Who are you? I managed to stammer. The girl tilted her head, her dark eyes glinting in the dim light. We're guests, she said simply. We never left. I stood frozen, staring at the children in the woods. Their presence was unnatural. Something about the way they moved, the blank stillness in their eyes, the way their voices carried on the wind, even though they weren't shouting. We're guests, the girl repeated, stepping closer to the edge of the trees. Her bare feet didn't make a sound on the forest floor. I wanted to move, to run back to the car, but my legs felt like lead. The boy tilted his head, mirroring his sister's eerie posture. You can't leave, he said softly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. What do you mean? I managed to ask, my voice shaking. The girl smiled faintly. No one ever leaves. Not really. That broke the spell. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to get back in the car. As I turned and ran, I heard their laughter again, sharp and hollow, echoing unnaturally around me. I slammed the car door shut and hit the gas. For a moment, I thought I might have escaped. But then after driving for what felt like an eternity, the scenery began to repeat. The same stretch of cracked asphalt, the same faded signs, and then the neon glow of the motel sign. No, I whispered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. This can't be happening. I stopped the car in the middle of the road, my breathing ragged. I looked around desperately for any clue, any indication of what was going on, but everything felt wrong. The air was too still. The trees didn't sway, even though I could feel the faintest breeze against my skin. And the light, It wasn't natural. The sun seemed stuck in a perpetual state of dawn, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. I decided to try another approach. Turning the car around, I drove off the road, cutting through the trees and onto a rough, overgrown trail. Branches scratched against the sides of the car as I pushed forward, determined to break free from whatever nightmare I'd found myself in. But after several minutes of bumpy, uneven driving, the trail opened up, and I found myself staring at the motel again. The parking lot was exactly as I'd left it. My car was still parked there, even though I was sitting in it. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel, screaming in frustration. "What do you want from me?" As if in response, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I snatched it up, desperate for any semblance of connection to the outside world. The screen displayed a single notification: unknown caller. My finger hovered over the answer button. I didn't want to pick it up, but something compelled me to press it. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaky. There was silence on the other end, and then, after a few seconds, a faint, distorted voice crackled through. "You're already here." The line went dead. I dropped the phone, my hands trembling. The motel loomed in front of me, its neon sign flickering like it was mocking me. I knew I couldn't keep driving in circles. Whatever was happening, the answers were inside that building. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the office, my legs feeling like they were moving through water. The air was heavier now, almost suffocating. When I pushed open the door, the man at the counter was gone. The room was empty, but the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingered in the air. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the small space. No response. I turned toward the row of keys hanging on the wall. Room 7's key was missing. A cold chill crept over me as I realized the implications. I was the only guest, wasn't I? I stepped back, my eyes darting around the office. And then I noticed something I hadn't before: a large black and white photograph hanging on the wall. It was an old picture of the motel, taken decades ago. The building looked newer, the neon sign pristine, and there were several people standing in front of it, smiling for the camera. But as I looked closer, my stomach dropped. In the back row, partially obscured by the others, was a man I recognized, the man from the front desk. And next to him, holding his hand, were two small children, a boy and a girl. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. It couldn't be. I spun around, my eyes landing on the door to room 7, just visible through the office window. The curtains were drawn, but I thought I saw movement behind them, a shadow, faint and fleeting. I knew I shouldn't go back. Every instinct screamed at me to get in my car and drive, even if it meant circling back to this place 100 more times. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, whatever force was keeping me trapped, it all centered around that room. I stepped outside, the gravel crunching under my feet. The door to room 7 seemed to beckon me, its peeling paint a stark contrast to the unnatural stillness of the motel. As I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. And then I heard it, a faint knock from the inside. I stood frozen outside the door of room 7, my heart hammering in my chest. The faint knock from inside was deliberate, almost mocking, and yet there was no way anyone could be in there. I whispered to myself, "You don't have to do this." But some part of me, a terrible, unrelenting curiosity, compelled me to turn the knob. It was cold under my fingertips, unnaturally so. The door creaked open, revealing the room inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was a mix of mildew and something metallic, like rusted iron. The air was thick, oppressive, and felt alive somehow, as if the room itself was breathing. The layout was standard for a cheap motel: a single bed with a faded floral bedspread, a small nightstand, and an ancient TV perched on a dresser. The curtains were drawn tightly, casting the room in shadows, but something about it felt off. It wasn't until I stepped fully inside that I noticed the walls. They weren't just aged or stained, they're always watching. Time is a loop, no escape. My eyes darted to a different section, where sentences overlapped in a chaotic tangle. The children know the truth. Don't trust the man at the desk. Room 7 is the end and the beginning. My pulse quickened as I backed away, feeling the walls pressing in. That's when I saw it, etched into the headboard of the bed in jagged, frantic letters. "Leave while you still can." I turned to leave, but the door had shut behind me. I grabbed the knob and twisted, but it wouldn't budge. My breathing grew ragged as I pulled harder, yanking at the door with all my strength. And then, behind me, I heard it, the sound of faint whispers. I turned slowly, my back pressed against the door. The whispers grew louder, swirling around the room like a storm, though I couldn't see their source. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The TV flickered on. Static filled the screen, but within the noise I thought I could make out shapes, faces, distorted and twisted, staring back at me. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening cacophony. I covered my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was inside my head now, drilling into my thoughts. Through the noise, a single phrase rose above the rest, repeated over and over. "You're one of us now." The light bulb above me burst, plunging the room into darkness. Panic clawed at me as I fumbled for my phone, using its screen to cast a weak glow. In the faint light, I saw them, the children. They stood at the foot of the bed, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes black pits that seemed to swallow the light. "You can't leave," the girl said, her voice unnervingly calm. The boy smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too many. "Not until you understand." "Understand what?" I shouted, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The girl tilted her head, and for the first time, her expression shifted into something like pity. "Why you're here." Before I could respond, the floor beneath me gave way. I fell into darkness, the air rushing past me as I tumbled, weightless and disoriented. When I hit the ground, it wasn't hard or cold. It was soft, almost spongy, and the smell of damp earth filled my nose. I opened my eyes to find myself lying in a narrow corridor, the walls made of packed dirt. Dim light seeped through cracks, casting eerie shadows that danced like flickering flames. Ahead of me, the corridor stretched endlessly, disappearing into darkness. Behind me, I heard footsteps. I scrambled to my feet and turned, but the footsteps stopped. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The silence was deafening, and then, faintly, I heard the children's laughter echoing through the corridor. It was coming closer. I ran. The corridor twisted and turned, but it never ended. The laughter followed me, growing louder, closer, until it felt like they were right behind me. Finally, I stumbled into an open space, a cavernous room lit by an unseen source. In the center stood the man from the front desk. He was smiling, his cigarette hanging loosely from his lips. But his eyes, they weren't human. They glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. "Welcome," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. I backed away, but the corridor I had come through was gone. "There's no need to be afraid," he continued, taking a slow drag of his cigarette. "You've made it this far. That's more than most can say." "What do you want from me?" I shouted. His smile widened, and he gestured to the space around us. "This place, it isn't what you think. It's not a motel. It's a threshold." "A threshold to what?" I demanded. "To the truth," he replied, his voice dripping with amusement. "But truth comes with a price." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the ground beneath me began to quake. The walls of the cavern shifted, and I realized with dawning horror that they weren't walls at all. They were faces. Thousands of faces, screaming silently, their mouths open in eternal agony. And in the center of it all, the man watched me with a grin that chilled me to my core. The cavern felt alive, pulsing with the silent screams of the faces embedded in its walls. The man at the center remained eerily calm, his glowing eyes fixed on me as if he were savoring my fear. "What is this place?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What are you?" He chuckled, exhaling a plume of smoke that seemed to hang unnaturally in the air. "This place is everything and nothing. It's where people come to meet the truths they've buried deep inside themselves. And me?" He gestured to himself, spreading his arms wide. "I'm just the keeper of the door." "The door to what?" I shouted, my frustration and terror boiling over. "To whatever you've been running from," he replied. I took a step back, my eyes darting to the shifting walls of faces. Their expressions of agony were unbearable, but I couldn't look away. Those people, I whispered, are they alive? In a sense, the man said. They're like you. They came here seeking something, an escape, a resolution, a reason. But they couldn't pay the price. What price? He tilted his head, his smile growing wider. The truth always demands something in return. Sometimes it's a memory, sometimes a piece of your soul, and sometimes... He stepped closer, his eyes burning brighter. It's everything. I backed away further, but the ground beneath me shifted, sending me stumbling. The cavern seemed to close in, the faces pressing closer, their silent screams growing louder in my mind. You're lying, I said, my voice trembling. The man laughed, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to reverberate through the walls. Am I? Or have you always known this place was waiting for you? I shook my head, refusing to believe him. I just wanted to find out what happened here, that's all. And you did, he said, his tone almost gentle. You uncovered the secret of the motel. But the question isn't what happened here. It's why you came in the first place. His words struck something deep within me, something I didn't want to confront. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. You've been carrying something heavy, haven't you? He said, taking another drag of his cigarette. Something you've buried so deep you've almost convinced yourself it isn't there. But this place, he gestured to the cavern around us. It knows. It always knows. I tried to deny it, but the words caught in my throat. Suddenly, the faces in the walls began to shift again. But this time, they weren't strangers. They were people I knew. My mother, my father, old friends, colleagues, and even strangers I'd passed on the street. Their faces appeared one by one, each wearing the same expression of anguish. And then I saw her, the face I had tried so hard to forget. Emily. Her eyes were wide, her mouth open in a silent scream, and her gaze locked onto mine. The memories I had suppressed came flooding back in an instant. The argument, the accident, the guilt that had eaten away at me every day since. No, I whispered, shaking my head. This isn't real. The man stepped closer, his voice low and soothing. Oh, but it is. You came here because you couldn't live with the weight of what you've done. You wanted answers, closure. But the truth, my friend, is that there is no escape from guilt. Only acceptance. Tears streamed down my face as I fell to my knees. The weight of the memories crushed me, and I felt the walls closing in, the faces surrounding me, judging me. What do you want from me? I sobbed. Your choice, he said, kneeling in front of me. You can stay here, become part of this place, and let it consume you like the others. Or you can face the truth and pay the price to leave. What's the price? Or I asked, my voice barely audible. He smiled, but there was no malice in it this time. Only a strange kind of pity. You'll find out soon enough. Before I could respond, the cavern began to quake. The walls shifted, and the faces started to dissolve, replaced by swirling shadows that seemed to stretch infinitely. The man stood and extended a hand to me. The door is open. All you have to do is step through. I hesitated, staring at his outstretched hand. The shadows around us grew darker, colder, and I knew I didn't have much time. Finally, I reached out and took his hand. The world around me dissolved into blinding light, and for a moment, I felt weightless. When the light faded, I found myself standing outside the motel. The neon sign flickered in the night, and the air was eerily still. I turned to look back at the building, but it was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. I checked my phone and saw that days had passed, though it felt like only hours. My car was parked nearby, covered in a thin layer of dust. As I got in and started the engine, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw something in my reflection, an unfamiliar shadow in my eyes. But when I blinked, it was gone. I drove away, the motel receding in my rearview mirror. I should have felt relief, but instead, there was a hollow ache in my chest. I had left the place, but a part of it hadn't left me. And as the road stretched ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped at all. That somewhere, somehow, the motel was still waiting.